Welcome to EFFector from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. You're listening to an audio companion to our email newsletter, keeping you on the cutting edge of digital rights issues. I'm Christian Romero.
And I'm Hudson Hongo. Later, we'll be talking to Paige Collings, Senior Speech and Privacy Activist at EFF, about the UK's Online Safety Act and the threat age verification laws pose to the free internet. We'll also let you know about some of the upcoming opportunities to connect with EFF. But first, let's cover this week's top stories. Okay, Christian, I know you just got back from the summer conferences in Las Vegas, and reliable sources tell me that you've also fallen ill. But I wanted to try something a little different this time, something like a memory test. I wanted to quiz you on some of the digital rights stories we blogged about in the past 2 weeks. Are you up for that?
Yeah, we'll try it. My throat is foggy. You know why, but we talk to a lot of people that care about our issues and ask questions about the blog posts. So I think that I might be able to do this. I think we can try.
All right, we'll see how it goes. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, first up, what's the name of Canada's sprawling surveillance bill, which EFF recently blogged would open the floodgates to U.S. surveillance?
Okay, so this isn't the UK's Online Safety Act.
No.
Which is like all the age verification stuff. This is something else. I think this was published right before I left, but if I remember right, it doesn't have a catchy name. Like a lot of these bills have something catchy.
Well, so the technical name is Bill C2, and their little cute name is the Strong Borders Act.
Okay. Yeah, I would not have gotten that. I did not remember that one.
I mean, I think part of the idea is that this legislation doesn't, they want to cover just like something that sounds good and vague. In this case, so Bill C2, it's a domestic surveillance bill for foremost. It makes it so that police spy agencies in Canada have the ability to, if it passes, can demand information about people's online activities if they reach the threshold of reasonable suspicion. And then companies holding any of the information, all sorts of online services, they'd only have 5 days to challenge the order, and they'd be have immunity from lawsuits about handing over the data. And sort of the element we were talking about in our blog post is that this is coming while Canada and the U.S. are negotiating a law enforcement information sharing agreement called U.S. Cloud Act. And our analysis is that this, along with being a sprawling domestic surveillance bill, would make it all that easier for cross-border surveillance, right? So first, Canadian authorities can gather this information without a warrant, and then depending on how negotiations go, it's very possible that U.S. law enforcement, federal government, other agencies would be able to demand this now much more easily accessible information from Canadian authorities. So
the surveillance network just is going across borders now. It's not just like we're worried about just U.S. stuff. It's like now they're all connecting it together, kind of.
Right. Okay. Second question. According to a new paper, what % of registered data brokers in California failed to respond to requests for personal data as required by state law?
I like that we're writing stuff like this because you always hear about things being passed and it's like, well, what's the follow-up? So I'm glad we're thinking about the follow-up.
Oh, yeah.
If I remember right, the number was really high. Like it was close to 45% or something.
I think I got a siren going by me right now. But yes, the researchers found that of the registered data brokers they contacted, only 43% didn't respond to the request for personal data at all. So the California Privacy Protection Act, which, as you said, was a privacy legislation that was passed in the state, required these registered data brokers to give you any information they have on you if you personally request it. And of course, as you might expect, that's not a particularly easy process to go through. But the researchers found that like you said, almost half of data brokers didn't do anything when they were asked to give up the personal data, which they have on us, right? It seems only fair if these private companies are without our consent or knowledge, like collecting a bunch of information on us, that we should be able to at least see the file. And as we pointed out on in our blog, this is part of the reason why whenever we are advocating for privacy protections, we want them to have teeth, right? So this bill ended up not having a private right of action, right? Doesn't allow individuals to sue companies for violations. So instead, we have to rely on regulatory bodies to enforce these requirements. And here, we're encouraging people, if you're a California resident who asks for your personal data as required under this law, and you don't get a response, to file a complaint with the California Privacy Protection Agency and the State Attorney General's office. Okay, this last one's actually just awful, but it's the news. What U.S. state recently subpoenaed a restaurant for surveillance video, contacts, and guest lists after it hosted an LGBTQ plus pride event?
Yeah, this I remember this story because this one like really sucked to read. And I think this came out like right before we went to Vegas. I'm pretty sure it was Florida. It was a drag show in Florida, right?
That's absolutely right. It was the restaurant called the Kilted Mermaid hosted a drag show earlier this year, and the state attorney general, without mentioning a specific law being violated, demanded all of this records data on this one night drag show. And as you can imagine, there's like a lot of issues that might come with this. I mean, the one that we pointed out was just a terrible chilling effect, right? Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that subpoenas that forced disclosure of members of a peaceful organization have like a terrible chilling effect on free expression. And obviously a performance like this is a clear example of First Amendment protected expression. And I think in this case, they didn't specifically mention, like I said, no law being violated was mentioned, but they're pursuing it under the Florida law that's been blocked by the Supreme Court, framed as a child protection measure. And what we see too often the case is any sort of, often these laws that are being framed as some sort of public safety prevention measure are turned into political retaliation, surveillance, and that's unfortunately what seems to be happening in Florida.
It is crazy seeing some of these laws, like, you know, they're aimed at doing one thing, but they're obviously going to chill a lot of other speech and rights for people. I also want to mention, I think that Rin wrote this blog post, and Rin knows how to make a headline. Like, the headline on all of her blog posts are just killer, so folks should check them out.
I believe the headline here was, you went to a drag show, now Florida wants your name, which,
yeah.
I mean, you know, it's like, it's easy to get lost in sort of like the technical details or legal frameworks. But I think bringing it to what these bad policies look like on the ground drives home like why this is important, right? The other week, I wrote a blog post about a sort of a brief we had filed in a case we have against the Sacramento Municipal Utility District that has to do with like smart meter surveillance. And there's a lot of different elements of it that are like awful and sort of complex, but like the fundamental reality of it is like, oh, like your utility meter becoming like a little spy that's installed on your home and is like potentially collecting information for like law enforcement to prosecute you. But yeah, I think whenever we are able to bring it back to the sort of what this looks like on the most micro level, right? All sorts of policies, laws might sound like they're addressing important needs or protecting us in some way. But then like what you have to look at is how, once they filter all the way down to enactment, enforcement, like what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, now it's time we're going to talk to our colleague Paige Collings about the UK's Online Safety Act. Welcome, Paige. Thanks for making the time to chat.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the UK Online Safety Act and why platforms are making changes now?
Yeah, so it's quite a long story. The Online Safety Act started out as the Online Harms White Paper from 2017, and its introduction sought to make the UK the safest place in the world to go online. It came off the back of a young girl who lost her life after seeing content online, which a UK court a few years back held that the internet had a more than negligible impact on her suicide. And so the UK's politicians at the time decided to take action. And so the way they saw fit was to introduce a new piece of legislation that was supposed to do two things. One was institute a criminal liability on platforms to remove legal but harmful content. And so that was determined by the Secretary of State. And fortunately, that part, through wonderful civil society advocacy, including EFF, we were able to get that component of the legislation scrapped. The second part was to prohibit children from seeing harmful content. And so to do that was to erode end-to-end encryption and institute this liability on platforms to uh, restrict restrict content based on children's ages or indeed everybody's ages. And so fast forward at least 4 years where this piece of legislation was debated under four different prime ministers. It had a very lengthy process through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and we ended up with a pretty big and behemoth of a bill, more than 260 pages. And in the period since 2023, when it passed, we've had Ofcom, the UK's regulator for the internet and online platforms. So Ofcom have been building out regulations to implement the Online Safety Act as it is now. And so that's why we've had this period of time between the bill passing and now what we're seeing, which is platforms implementing the bill, making changes to implement the bill. And so what we've seen in the past 2 weeks, especially since July 25th, were platforms have taken from Spotify to Reddit to X to even Google. So the UK Online Safety Act, as it is, institutes that all platforms that carry services in the UK, so that does range from social media platforms, search engines, indeed music streaming platforms, they must take action to prevent children, so under 18s, seeing harmful content. And so there are two parts of this that we've had that are some issues. The first is the categorization of harmful content, and the second is how you're going to institute that. And so that's how we've ended up here. We've had a pretty shaky rollout. It's been met with really inconsistent implementation in the period since July 25th. Some platforms implemented and introduced changes before that. In the weekend, in that weekend, 26th, 27th of July, we saw websites that host pornography start to roll it out. So that was after the bill came into effect, the regulation came into effect. And so what we've seen is a really janky rollout. And that's where we led to today, which is 2 weeks of really heavy lessons learned in terms of how not to introduce legislation that censors the internet.
So effectively, what this regulation imposes is a kind of age gating, right? Where like children need to be blocked from accessing certain types of content. What have these age gating mechanisms looked like in practice in the UK?
So it's varied quite a bit from service to service. So perhaps to give you some examples of how it's looking, we're seeing Ofcom introduced quite a broad framing for how platforms can introduce mechanisms to verify people's ages, essentially to ensure, and quite specifically in this scenario, what the UK has essentially asserted on platforms is that they must ensure users are over the age of 18. And so what it's not doing is taking the specific ages of every user, but it's making sure that the content they're seeing, they must be over 18. And so that's looked different on a number of different platforms because the UK has provided an extraordinarily broad scope for platforms to introduce that. And so, for example, on Spotify, the company has partnered with a third party to verify ages through selfies or a video. We're seeing on certain social media platforms the same. So, externalizing this to a third party, people will take a selfie or record a video and it will undertake some age assurance. So, it'll basically assess the category through biometric technology and it will say, yeah, this person is over 18 or not. Um, but other mechanisms include assessing bank details. And so you will sign up to a website, it will check your bank, and that bank will kind of verify is this person over 18. Another categorization of this verification process is through emails. And so, and this has been a tactic deployed quite extensively on the pornography websites. people will share their email address, and in doing so, the technology that's being used will kind of surveil the internet, see where else this email address is being used. And if it looks like those email addresses have been used for actions that are over 18, then that means that you're over 18. And so what we're seeing here is an externalization of the age verification checks to lots of different other data points. So, as I mentioned, banks, email addresses, utility companies, beyond the traditional form I think that we see in a lot of places, which is just checking a selfie or a video and checking that through biometric technologies.
As you suggested earlier, there's a host of issues that obviously come downstream from this. I think I probably first we should just talk about the privacy issues involved with passing along all of these different data points. What are some of the risks of this kind of data collection and sharing?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it's a pretty pertinent issue of this technology, and I think one element that we had spoken about a lot through civil society advocacy throughout the last 5 years, and particularly in the last 2 years since Ofcom has started to implement the Online Safety Act, is that the bill and the regulations did not do enough to guardrail user privacy. It gives platforms and services so much scope to implement age verification and age checks in a way that isn't guardrailed enough to secure the user data. When platforms and services are choosing different methods, they're able to almost define this themselves. Ofcom and the Online Safety Act, of course, have said that there are requirements. So there were due diligence requirements, transparency requirements on platforms. They must have undertaken this before July 25th. It was a requirement by Ofcom as a result of the Online Safety Act. And so whilst Ofcom and politicians in the UK that passed the Online Safety Act, perhaps a good faith reading is that they did everything they could to ensure that they believe user data is protected. A bad faith reading is that it was a lazy approach at guardrailing user data um, in a way that was negligent of the impact of what could happen here. And so when we're seeing data collected and shared with third parties. That of course, the very clear issue here is that users are not sure about what happens after that's being collected. Each platform has a different policy, each service has a different policy. Is the data going to be retained for an hour just for the verification check? Is it going to be retained on a cloud, on a local drive? Is it going, where is it going after that? Is it going to be sold? There are enough examples of data breaches, of hacks, of issues that once data is collected, we don't know where it's going. And whilst companies can arguably delude themselves into thinking they've taken all the adequate measures, we are seeing in lots of other spaces that's not enough. And hacks are always possible, data breaches are always possible. And when we're assessing that this piece of legislation is such a broad scope, it's impacting so many pieces of the online world, users are having to upload, whether it's government ID, whether it's their bank details, whether it's an email address, to engage in day-to-day life, not just to access things like pornography. It's broadening the capacity for invasive technologies to to scrape data. It's broadening the possibility for bad actors to hack the data and take the data. And of course, just the general ecosystem of data surveillance that once data is collected, we cannot ever be sure what happens to it. And so there aren't enough data minimization methods in place, zero knowledge proofs aren't in place. It's just a really ill thought out approach to protecting people online.
Basically expanding the scope of data collection by every UK internet user times however many different age assurance platforms or
Absolutely.
vendors are out there, which
Absolutely.
just becomes like, right, this enormous pot of data, which we don't know where it's going, how long it's being
Hmm.
retained, and
Hmm.
is probably pretty appealing to, both the recognized bad actors and anyone who just has intent that goes beyond what users want.
And
Um,
we're seeing in the US, I think very recently there were leaks of digital IDs roll out. And again, this is a very trial and error situation, which is the worst case scenario for things when we're talking about such personal, intimate data. But this is common. Data breaches are common, hacks are common. The rollout of digital ID at a time when inf core information is being taken, is being hacked, is being leaked, is unfathomable, actually.
So one of the other big buckets of issues here that you also mentioned is sort of censorship, right? What kinds of information are being classified as potentially harmful and thus become harder to access? So what kinds of information are we seeing being put behind these age gates?
Mhm. So unfortunately, we already have a list of examples because in the last 2 weeks, much information has been kind of caught up or swept up in this net of harmful. When the list was initially created, uh, it was expanded to legal but harmful, as I mentioned earlier, and in that component, scrapping it kind of was categorized as information harmful to children or those under the age of 18, and so essentially we can almost categorize it in two ways. One is pornographic content, and the second is content that around self-harm, bullying, doxing, so online harms like that. Um, Very laudable, of course. These are really important topics. We don't want people to be bullied online or offline, and all of those kind of components. But what we're seeing here are essentially, we can maybe break it down into two things. Firstly, this is very subjective. What is categorized as harmful is always going to be arbitrated by those who have access to defining that. And in the UK right now, what we're seeing is what's categorized as harmful is subject to the government, it's subject to politicians and indeed Ofcom. And in implementation of the Online Safety Act, it's now almost at the discretion of the platforms and services too. They will be able to build out tools, algorithmic moderation tools, and human moderation, of course, in a lot of services like meta services like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, any of these online platforms. Humans also moderate this. And so once it goes kind of through the automatic moderation, it can go to an individual. But essentially, what we're seeing here is a very catch-all approach to moderation. Let's go again with a good faith reading there is that these algorithms are catching content that they're not supposed to, and it's just a mistake. We see this often. Companies will say it was, I'm so sorry, it's just a mistake. In the US, there are a lot of pro LGBTQ content that was been swept up in the last 2 years that Meta has said for children, for younger use, for under 16s and under 18. And Meta has said it was just a mistake. They've remedied the situation, but the harm has already been done. A bad faith reading there is this is a good opportunity for platforms to institute censorship on topics they don't want to host. And a third reading, which is relatively more neutral and instituted essentially by the legislation and Ofcom's implementation, is that the consequences for non-compliance with this legislation are so high. It's criminal. It's a potential jail sentence. It's a huge fine potentially. It's also that Ofcom has the possibility of blocking access to the service in the UK for non-compliance. That platforms and services will take a more aggressive approach at censoring content because they don't want to be caught in the web of non-compliance. And so there are three kind of framings here. But what this essentially means is that content that's legal and that should be online is being censored.
Mm.
Um, on X, a few days into I think maybe the 26th or the 27th, I'm not too sure on the date, but quite soon after the implementation of the Online Safety Act's age verification, checks content that was at a pro-Palestinian protest on X was removed. It was harmful. We're seeing on Reddit a massive amount of censorship for on lots of different subreddits. One is on r-cider, and so that was now harmful for children, needed to be removed. We've seen on Spotify albums now. It's if you're not over 18, you can't access the album. So explicit are not appropriate. And so what we're seeing is such a wide scope for censorship that even if it was to be complied with in its most rigid form, would already be so much content. It would already catch an exponential amount of content that should remain. But given the high cost of non-compliance, given the current state of where things are in terms of reduced speech for pro-LGBTQ content, pro-Palestinian content, kind of content of this nature in the UK that's already being censored, this is an additional vector to censor that. And so I think when we look at the definitions of this, there are lots of examples. Canada's attempt at age verification with Bill S210, that sought to kind of protect children from pornography and online harms, but also to protect women from the violence against women that kind of comes from the online world. And so just decided to sweep kind of any nude content up, but in doing so, captures essential information for breast cancer survivors, essential information for reproductive health, LGBTQ rights. So in doing so, we're sweeping up so much content that's essential. You're really reducing people's access to information, reducing educational resources, and placing that liability on the service. And so, of course, the incentive there is to capture this in their moderation tools to avoid non-compliance with the bills. And so, what we're seeing here is a massive, tool for I think essentially we can call it a tool for censorship, and it's open to the discretion of the services how they want to implement that.
Um, as you mentioned Canada, and I think that goes into my next sort of question, which is I know unfortunately that the UK is not the only place where age assurance, age gating, age verification of the internet, whatever you they're calling it, is being pursued. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the other places where we're seeing versions of this kind of regulation?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, as I mentioned, and as you just touched upon, Canada is one example, and I think that's a very interesting example just because it specifically tries to touch upon violence against women and this real connection of an online harm and an offline harm and how they encourage one another, how they exist in the same ecosystem, and also how, again, it's such a short-sighted approach because none of these offline harms have technological solutions. They require a much broader, holistic, and intentional approach. And what we're doing right now is a very short-sighted, relatively lazy approach to solving a situation that deserves a much, much more attention. In France, there have been lots of talks, lots of kind of legislative developments around banning pornography. In the European Commission, we have desires to institute device-based age verification tools. They bring a whole host of different problems, of course, much harder to circumvent when they're on the device, much harder to avoid as a service or a platform there. And of course, that is kind of the approach that ILO, Pornhub's parent company have decided to back rather than service-based age verification because it kind of takes the liability away from them. But it just enhances the censorship and privacy implications on the user. In Australia, it looks quite likely that at the end of this year, there'll be a social media ban for under 16s. And so we're seeing different approaches to the same issue, which is that there are very clearly online harms that are impacting children. And this is something that we at EFF have never disputed. We've worked with organizations like Five Rights in the UK who work on children's rights. Um, to figure out how the best approach here. But what we're seeing, and I think very recently in the US, of course, we had the court ruling that is it build out a pathway and impacts into more age verification. We're also seeing at state level in Florida this year. Kind of, I think maybe the list is more than 24 states now have age verification measures for lots of different issues that they're seeing as problematic, but essentially guardrailing information from children online. And so we're seeing this widespread approach. Countries are taking different specific tools or they're touching on certain areas that they want to combat with gating children from online information. In the UK, it's almost a catch-all. It's like, okay, we'll take parts of all of this and put it all together, and you just have to figure it out as a service. If you don't like it, you can just leave. And we're seeing that also. Smaller platforms are already closing down because it's such a complex piece of legislation to implement. Um, but there is this widespread approach, which is that the UK is not alone. There are lots of other countries doing this and doing it in different ways, and all of them are flawed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's clearly parts of the UK Island Safety Act rollout that are specific. Parts of the chaotic rollout are specific to this legislation itself, but it feels like this approach, as you said, a sort of short-sighted approach. The big ones we're talking about, these sort of privacy issues, these censorship issues, are inherent to the intervention that's being suggested, right? How do you get assurance of somebody's age without collecting lots of data that somebody's holding? How do you block content without either the state or a private company just making a judgment call, and presumably a rather conservative one, about what is considered harmful or if it happens to be pornographic?
Yeah. And in that regard, I think as I mentioned, I think what policymakers are looking for is an easy solution to a very complex problem. And we often get asked, so what's the solution? As if it has one sentence. It doesn't, and it's very frustrating, I know, to policymakers, to parents, to users. In the UK, VPNs, the search for VPNs had skyrocketed over the weekend after the Online Safety Act passed because people were freaking out. What do? I want to go on this website now. I can't do my exist online in a way that's going to prohibit my access to information without sharing this really intimate details, right? And so when you try, as you mentioned, when you try to ensure that under 18s can't access information, you have to make sure you're collecting information on everybody because otherwise it's not possible. And again, that has even broader privacy concerns. We know that some of these companies aren't able to, they have kind of a window of a year where maybe they can incorrectly get the information. And so users that would be 18 might be flagged to 17 and so can't access information. And so the list is endless about why this is a flawed approach. But I think sadly, for almost everybody, this requires a much more intensive conversation, and we need to look at the harms that we're talking about. So something I've been discussing in a lot of conversations is we know that driving without a seatbelt is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
The solution would not be to ban cars. The solution is to institute safety mechanisms. So we know that if you don't have a seatbelt, you might fly through the windshield, and there are so many scenarios there. So having a seatbelt is one way of protecting yourself. We're not just going to ban people from access, getting in a car. This essentially does that. Oh, a road is dangerous. You can no longer cross it. These are not the solutions. What we need to look at is the exact harm. And so when we say children looking at pornography, they should not be able to look at pornography. What exactly are we stopping people from looking at there? Is it the ecosystem of violence against women? Is it that it's building out an unrealistic world that they're going to have to engage in? The list is endless, right? But what we're not going to do is just try and stop children from accessing this, because what we know is, one, they will find a way to access it if they want. Two, there's a world offline where they will still encounter pornography, and so the harm is not removed. And three, the current solution of trying to block this content is only going to impact all users rather than reduce the harm that we're looking at. If we're talking about bullying online, we know that once that computer is closed or the device is locked, the bullying will continue. Children will still go to school the next day with probably some of the same people. We know the internet provides a much bigger platform for these harms to exist. Instead of being bullied by 3 people, you might be bullied by 3 million because you're online. But we have to do better at assessing what the specific harm is there and tackling that. When we're talking about free speech online, what exactly are we trying to limit, and how do we target that without censoring a whole host of other legal speech? And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think it's one of those that requires much more nuanced solutions. And sadly, this is actually how the Online Safety Act started out. It was much more nuanced, it was much more specific. But as attention grew, I think as harms developed, politicians panicked and they decided to just throw all these issues in this bill. And it came out in an act that was so extensive and said everything without being able to protect. It said everything and protects nothing. And so we're now in a period of implementation where Ofcom are kind of scrambling to try and deduce this. They're working with civil society organizations. We've submitted to consultations already, but it's not enough. It's not enough, and I think from what we're seeing from this rollout is the scramble in implementation from services and platforms is nobody is this scramble kind of for the right technology or the right method shows there is not one. Otherwise, that would be the one that has been decided upon. There is no technology that can solve this issue, and so what we need here is a much more cohesive thinking. Politicians need to work much closer with experts in civil society. This is a complex issue that requires people that know what they're talking about. And we also can see that civil society are not alone in this. It's not just organizations like EFF that are advocating against this. It's services like Signal, Wikimedia had a court hearing today in the UK about the implementation of and the scoping of the Online Safety Act. This is a broader issue for the internet, and it's going to impact everybody. And so when you have the entirety of the experts talking about it, you would hope that the government would listen, and I hope that Ofcom will start to kind of heed the lessons of the last 2 weeks and indeed the last 5 years.
Okay, finally, one last question, Paige. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
want to sort of bring back focus to at least, what it is we're trying to protect here in a small way. And I wanted to ask you what the last thing you've seen on the web that's given you hope or joy? It doesn't have to be serious. It can just be fun, but I'm curious.
Yeah. Uh, I think the most fun thing I've seen today, and it's been a heavy day for the internet. I woke up seeing almost the extinction of Al Jazeera in Gaza, and so
Mm.
that was heavy. And then a few hours later, I saw a video of Demi Lovato and the Jonas Brothers reuniting to sing a song from Camp Rock, which was very much a movie that I loved in my childhood. And so I think, as with everything, it's great that we're able to balance things out. And I don't know that 3 minute video brought me a bit of joy this afternoon, and so I enjoyed. Yeah, it brings me hope, right? We can talk about the internet being a scary place and a place where that children need to be hid from, but at the same time, it brings so much joy, and that's why we work to protect it so much.
Right. Both a place of great joy and important information.
Exactly.
Well, thanks so much again, Paige, for taking the time to talk to me. All right. And now events. Christian, what opportunities to connect with EFF are coming up?
Yeah, well, we have an EFF member speakeasy in New York this Friday on August 15th. That'll be happening while we're in New York for the Hope Conference, where we'll be hosting a series of talks and panels. We'll also have a membership booth where you can come get some of your latest swag. And of course, you can catch us at the EFF Awards live and in person in San Francisco on September 10th.
Oh, thanks, Christian. I could hardly tell you were sick.
Okay, good. I'm glad we passed it off. Yeah.
I hope I don't catch it. I mean, how in general do you try to stay well when you're traveling? Do you have any?
I probably should do a lot more. I ate pretty terribly while we were in Vegas and had a lot of late nights. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, I barely even try anymore when I'm traveling, like to eat like real food. Like, I don't know what you do, right? I'm like, oh, I'm going to try to put a yogurt, like a yogurt container in the tiny hotel fridge. Like, I don't know.
No, it's impossible. And in Vegas, you're like, I'm just going to eat whatever's in the hotel because it's so hot outside and it's always oversalted diner foods and stuff. But, and I stayed out really late. There were a lot of parties to connect with folks. So it was a good time. I'm
Good.
glad if you're listening and I saw you, it was really fun.
Well, good. I'm glad that it was a pleasurable trade-off. Well, that's it for this week's EFFector Audio Companion. Thanks for listening in.